for our live stream lecture, the last part of our three-part live stream this weekend. We had two really good Q&As on Friday and Saturday night. We are here every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday for live stream content where we get to engage with the community. The community is usually engaging with us, watching videos and enjoying content throughout the week. So we figured we'd give you a little bit of a boon, a blessing, a gift on the weekend. So Fridays at 8 p.m. Eastern, we have our first part of our live stream Q&A, followed by our second part on Saturday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern, although last night was at 8 p.m. Eastern, where we take all sorts of questions, all sorts of topics, history-wise, social studies, social sciences, geopolitics, both past and current. That's what the channel is here for. That's what I cover in videos all throughout the week and all throughout the time. So the live stream idea started back in the summer as a way to give back and let people bring questions and comments and bring up topics that they wanted to discuss. And so those have been a lot of fun. And we had two really good ones Friday and Saturday night. And we are now bringing you the last part of our weekly weekend live streams, where it is a live stream lecture. We just started this a few weeks ago, where Sunday afternoons there's some history to talk about, topics that I used to want to discuss on the live stream but never could quite get to because of all the great questions and conversations and people coming in and talking about stuff. So today I'm not going to be answering questions and interacting with the chat as much as I normally do. Instead, I'm going to be bringing some lecture content, giving you some information, some historical goodies about topics that I find particularly interesting at a particular moment. And two that occurred to me is obviously the Cold War, and I'm going to try to go over that in a pretty comprehensive way, although an hour alone is not enough time, and I'm going to be doing a second topic anyways. I do have some videos on the Cold War. I probably should make a long-form video, maybe even an hour-long mini documentary or semi-formal documentary where I discuss the impact, causes, effects, and events of the Cold War, one of the most important events in human history, and definitely the predominant, long-lasting issue of the 20th century. I mean, World War I lasted for 4 years. World War II lasted for about 6 or 8 years, depending on whose count you're going by. And those things obviously are extremely important and extremely influential. Obviously, the Soviet Union, one of the main rivals in the Cold War to the United States, the creation of the first communist government in the world with the Soviet Union, with the Bolshevik Revolution, is extremely important. But probably more important and longest lasting of any event, of any historical phenomenon during the 20th century, was indeed the Cold War, which happened between the United States and the Soviet Union from basically the end of World War II all the way until the early 1990s. So hello, welcome. I really am looking forward to talking about the Cold War with you today on our live stream lecture for the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. If you like all things history, if you like learning about history and social studies and different topics, and you like listening to the sound of my voice maybe, consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. We're at just over 5,400 subscribers. The goal is 6,000 by the end of the year, a legion of, albeit friendly, neighborhood historians. Becoming a friendly neighborhood historian is as easy as liking and subscribing, and we are bringing you some great history content from the United States today with my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, in the chat. He will probably put the social media handles there so you can follow. But if you enjoy history, if you enjoy social sciences, consider liking and subscribing. We'll be talking about the Cold War, which I was just introducing right there. And also later on, if we have some time, if not, it might be next Sunday, we will be discussing there's the social media handles. I will pin that in the chat, and you guys can follow me on those platforms. But if time allows, and if not, we will discuss it next weekend. We will be talking about the influence and history of Ellis Island, probably the most important immigration center in all of human history. So grab some coffee, grab something to read. Don't grab something to read. Hopefully you're listening to me and reading the chat. But grab some coffee, kick up your feet, and enjoy some Friendly Neighborhood History, my live stream lecture, which will hopefully one day, fingers crossed, transform into the Friendly Neighborhood History podcast. But we can only hope and pray. So, or who knows? Or wish or cross our fingers, whatever it is. So yes, this is some Cold War history for you guys, brought to you by the Friendly Neighborhood History. So let me paint the picture of where the world stood at the beginning of the Cold War. For any historical event, it is incumbent upon the person teaching about that historical event, any historian, to discuss the background that formed that historical event and the events surrounding it and what would happen because of that event. So the Cold War is obviously one of these historical events that obviously predominates most of the history of the 20th century. It lasts for almost half a century, and it starts in the 1940s when people barely have any television, when there are barely any televisions, and it ends in the 1990s right before the creation of the internet. So There is a lot of history to unpack there. But basically, in World War II, the Soviet Union had been invaded by the Nazis in 1940. One in Operation Barbarossa. The Soviet Union had been a communist government for about 20 years at this point, thanks to the Bolshevik Revolution at the end of World War I, which had led to the formation of the first communist government under Vladimir Lenin and then his successor, Joseph Stalin. Stalin was still around by this time in World War II, and he was known for his brutal repressive tactics, but also his extreme efficiency at getting Russia modernized and mechanized, basically forcing the Industrial Revolution 100 years later down the throats of the Russian people, obviously at great physical and human cost to everybody. So that was something to see there. But basically, yeah. So the Soviet Union was a communist government, the first communist government in the world. And after Lenin died in 1924, he was eventually succeeded by Joseph Stalin, who rapidly industrialized the country, but at a great cost. He forced collectivization, confiscation of goods, other things, seizing the means of production at heavy cost with millions of lives lost. So he was known for being a brutal dictator. He purged the Communist Party of loyal communists, priests, anyone who he thought was subversive to the communist cause would be eliminated along with their families and anyone who would speak for them. And so the guilt by association was strong. Stalin's paranoia was strong. He was a pretty resilient but pretty paranoid dictator. And the Russians and Stalin had proven to be very resilient during Operation Barbarossa and the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, which had almost brought about the end of the Soviet Union at that point. Anyways, you've got your shout out. Anyways, so what I was going to say is, so the Soviet Union had managed to hold off the Nazi invasion and push them back using the elements, the Russian winter, to their advantage. They had won the battles of Stalingrad and Leningrad and been able to eventually push the Nazis out of the Soviet Union and turn the tide against them, rushing through Eastern Europe and occupying these lands, basically, instead of liberating them, putting them under new management. And by the time they got to Berlin, they were first to get to Berlin, the Germans had all but collapsed and the Third Reich was over. That brought about VE Day, Victory in Europe, May 8th, 1945, when World War II ended. So now, the question was, communism had a devotion to spread. It was not a self-contained ideology. Although Stalin had been okay with settling it in the Soviet Union, he had also promoted a lot of espionage and other activities in order to spread it to as many parts of the world as he could. And now, with the Soviet Union being able to occupy militarily Eastern Europe, places like Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the eastern part of Germany, it seemed like the Soviet Union had a stranglehold on these areas and could spread communism there. This was a concern of the Western allies, particularly the United States and Great Britain. The United States and Great Britain weren't sure what to do exactly with these people who they had fought with in the war. They had needed Stalin to help them defeat the Germans, and Stalin had been extremely clear that he needed them to defeat the Germans as well. And there was a lot of mutual usage by both sides going on. Stalin relied on Western supplies and aid throughout the war to be able to defeat the Germans. And the Allies needed the Nazis to have a second front opened up on the east so that they could invade Normandy at D-Day and be able to push into Germany after the Battle of the Bulge at the beginning of 1945. So both sides had needed each other, both sides had worked with each other, both sides had used each other, and to one degree or another, both sides did not trust each other. There was definitely some admiration in the West for Stalin and his ability to withstand the Nazis. Americans seemed to love the idea of the underdog, and it was no less the case in this situation. But a lot of people were very skeptical of communism. There had been a Red Scare in the 1920s when communism had first taken over the Soviet Union, and now it didn't seem like things were that different. In fact, the rumor and the word on the street was that things were a lot worse for the people of the Soviet Union, and a lot of people in the West weren't sure what to think of Stalin, Uncle Joe. Some people thought that he was a dictatorial figure, but had done a great deed for the world and should be treated as a hero and taken with a grain of salt. And others thought that he was absolutely repulsive and awful. So there was a lot of debate about how to deal with the Soviet Union, how to deal with the communist influence. Some on the American front, such as George S. Patton, wanted to invade the Soviet Union and continue the war and and overthrow Stalin's government. Now, whether this would have worked or not, meaning the British, French, and Americans would have had to push the Soviets all the way through Eastern Europe and all the way back to Russia, where they had just defeated the Nazis, is definitely this definitely was an issue for the Soviet Union and for the United States. The Allies didn't think that they could actually muster enough support to be able to effectively defeat the Soviet Union. And so they decided against it. And besides, the Soviet Union had helped them, and the new U.S. president, Harry Truman, because Franklin Roosevelt had died, believed that he would need the Soviets' help in order to defeat the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. The Eastern Front of the war was still going on, and they needed the help of the Soviets there. However, acquiring the atom bomb via the Manhattan Project, Truman didn't believe that he needed the Soviets' help anymore. And so he did it on his own. Rather than giving Stalin more land and more influence in different areas of Asia, he decided to basically go on his own, and using the atom bombs was able to bomb Japan into submission in August of 1945, thus leading to VJ Day and the end of the war. So the question of the resettlement and the reestablishment of Europe after World War II is where the Cold War really begins. The Western countries wanted democracy, self-determination, and for these Eastern European countries to be able to have free and fair elections and not be under the thumb of Soviet ideology. Stalin was perfectly fine with free and fair elections as long as those free and fair elections involved the election between two different communists or different communist factions. And so for him, it was a matter of which communists will you elect, not will you elect conservative right-wing government, left-wing government, or socialism. For him, basically, what really mattered at the end of the day was making sure that these Eastern European countries would fall under the sway of communism to continue to progress the workers' paradise and the communist revolution worldwide. Stalin had been subtly and, like I said, through espionage, fighting for this for 20 years, although he had taken a far less severe approach towards the spreading of communism than some of his associates, so like Leon Trotsky, who he had exiled and then later hunted down and assassinated. So basically, by the end of the war, there was a lot of tension between the two sides, and there was this growing question and growing darkness of mistrust and anxiety regarding what would happen next. There was obviously a lot of evidence that Stalin was not a man of his word, he was not reliable, and he was quite repressive of his own people. And the question was, do we want communism, an ideology that we have heretofore hated, spreading to these Eastern European countries, who were also, the people of those countries were brutalized by the Soviets during World War II. In fact, near the end of World War II, the Allies reported that Eastern Europeans were actually fleeing, not from the Nazis anymore, but they were fleeing west to get away from the Soviet Union because they didn't want to live under Soviet occupation. So the military occupation of Eastern Europe and Germany begins at this time, where basically the United States, France, and Britain occupy the western half of Germany and the western half of the city of Berlin, and the Soviets occupy the eastern half of Germany and the eastern half of Berlin. Now, Berlin is squarely in the eastern part of Germany, but it's this capital of Germany, and it's the most important city in Germany, so dividing it between the east and the west made sense. So basically, the question of the Western allies, especially the United States, become extremely concerned about the spread of communism and the fear about all of that. So they decide that the best thing that they can possibly do is start to send large amounts of aid to Europe in order to rebuild Europe, stabilize Europe, places like Germany and Italy, which have been devastated by the war, but also France and Great Britain. But they are also worried about the rise of socialist and communist governments that will either be sympathetic to the Soviets and destabilize American influence in the region, or will flat out join the communist revolution and thus spread more communism to the West. There's also the fear of communism in the United States amongst Hollywood and labor unions. There's the purging of these areas. There's McCarthyism. There was an entire House committee called the HUAC Committee, the House Un-American Affairs Committee, which was devoted completely to rooting out communism wherever it could during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So the fear of communism loomed large over the West, particularly the United States. And so the fear was, how will communism spread, and how do we stop it from spreading? And will we stop it from spreading? Are these really our allies? Are these really our friends? How should we treat them, and how should we address them? What should be our approach to these peoples after World War II? And basically, Harry Truman has to deal with this question, and he chooses to take a hardline stance against communism. He backs up governments in Greece and Turkey to prevent communist revolutions from spreading there in the late 1940s. He gives a speech and signs a document which later becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, which basically reasserts America's efforts to stop communism from spreading wherever it goes. And at the same time, the biggest question comes down to Germany. With the Soviet Union, with Stalin basically forcing communist governments down the throats of Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, it becomes obvious that Eastern European countries are starting to go over to the communist side, whether willingly or unwillingly, and communist governments are being set up all throughout the Eastern Bloc, as it comes to be known. The real question is what will happen to Germany, which is not split into East and West just yet, but has a Western area occupied by the Allies and the Eastern area occupied by the Soviets. So there's a lot of questions about all of this. And basically what happens is, in West Berlin, there's basically this idea that the Marshall Plan, which was the effort to rebuild European countries to avoid them from falling into communist traps at the end of World War II, is given to the Germans. The Americans offer it to the Eastern European countries and the Soviets, but the Soviets, building Comecon, C-O-M-E-C-O-N, I'm serious, it's called Comecon, want to rebuild Eastern Europe on their own dime in a more communistic way that will establish a tighter connection between them and the Eastern European countries. The same way the Marshall Plan, which is giving aid to Western Europe and Germany, will create tighter bonds between the United States and the Western European powers. So at the end of the day, what you have is you have the Americans sending aid to Germany, and especially to the city of Berlin, and this leads to a standoff. The Soviets, who occupy the city, don't want aid being brought into Berlin, so they block off the roads and the bridges so that the American supplies, these capitalist supplies, do not go into Berlin. Do not go into Berlin. Do not go into East Germany. The Americans' response is to airlift the supplies in and drop care packages with food, building supplies, clothing, materials. It's a very charitable act, but it's obviously got ulterior motives attached to it. The Soviets, basically not wanting to start another war by shooting down Allied planes, basically kneel and allow the aid to go in, and that is the first standoff of the Cold War. It's called the Berlin Airlift, and we'll go back to Berlin again. It's basically, at this point, you could say, I believe it's in 1949, that the Cold War really begins. You have the Western Allies beefed up by the United States and loyal to democratic government, and you have the Eastern Bloc countries of Central and Eastern Europe becoming more and more connected to the Soviet Union and more close to them. Meanwhile, there's a couple of more things for concern for the United States. Not all is well in the world for them. In 1949, China, the largest country in the world, becomes communist as Mao Zedong defeats the nationalist forces under Jiang Jiechi, or as they know him in the West, Chiang Kai-shek, and Shek is forced to flee to Taiwan. Formosa was what the British had called it. And so at this time, Japan has been occupied by the United States for a few years, and the United States and the Soviet Union have agreed to split Korea. North Korea would have a government set up by the Soviet Union, which, shocker, was a communist government, and the southern portion of Korea would have a democratic government, which was shockingly set up by the United States. So you have a free government or what the U.S. would call a free government in the south, a communist government in the north. So these are two, so you've got communism in the northern half of Korea. You have now the largest country in the world with unlimited natural resources, huge amounts of farmland, and just been through World War II and led by the very strong Mao Zedong. You have China being communist. You have fears of communism in Southeastern Asia as the Indochina countries are revolting against the French, led by Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. So there's this fear of communism spreading throughout all the world. Stalin wanted to spread it into Western Europe. It didn't work, but he had successfully spread it throughout Eastern Europe. In 1948, Winston Churchill gives a speech at the University of Missouri with President Truman in attendance, who didn't want him to say this, but Churchill calls it like it was. He says, an iron curtain has descended across Eastern Europe. Basically, there is a line that is drawn, thanks to the Berlin Airlift. East Berlin and East Germany and all the Eastern European countries are part of the Soviet sphere of influence, and the Western countries, which will soon join an organization called NATO, are under the influence of the United States. Great Britain, France, Italy. Interestingly enough, the fascist dictator of Spain, Francisco Franco, is allowed to stay in power despite all of his repression of his people, despite him helping the Nazis during World War II, because he promises to ban communism in his country. So the United States, as it does throughout the Cold War, tolerates very brutal regimes, very corrupt regimes, at this expense of fighting communism. It's basically a pick your poison, lesser of two evils, and sometimes they just flat out ignore the atrocities committed by some of these people like Francisco Franco, like the governments of South Vietnam that I'll talk about in a minute. So back to Asia. So you've got North Korea, you have China, now the largest country in the world, fully communist, and then all of a sudden, shocking to everybody, because they were not supposed to be able to get this as quick as they did, the Soviet Union successfully tests an atom bomb in the summer. That terrifies the United States and obviously leads to a OSS, which later becomes the CIA, and the FBI investigating all over the place to find out how the Soviets got the information from the United States. Because at that point, thanks to the Manhattan Project, the United States was the only one with nuclear technology that involved the ability to create nuclear weapons. Thanks to the contributions of Einstein's theories and Niels Bohr, and of course the great work of Robert J. Oppenheimer, the United States had been able to cultivate and split the atom and create an atom bomb. They had 3. They had used 2 on Japan, but they were building more. But now, 4 years later, the Soviets have their own nuclear bomb. How did they get it this quickly? Well, one of the men named Edmund Klemper, it's not Klemper. It's one of the people who was, I think he was a British man. I forget his name off the top of my head. But he had been working with the Manhattan Project. He had been a communist spy. In fact, Oppenheimer, and the movie is fantastic, by the way, but Oppenheimer is investigated as a communist spy because the information that he was able to do at Los Alamos in New Mexico is somehow leaked to the Soviets through this third party and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, these two spies for the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union had been sending spies over to the United States for a long time. In retrospect, McCarthyism and the hunt for communism and the Red Scare of the 1940s and 50s seems like a bunch of hooey. But there was a lot of fear back then, and I have often compared it historically to the idea of if the United States found out today that there were high-ranking members of ISIS, or at this point, ISIS isn't even that relevant, high-ranking members of the Russian government or China or Iran leading American institutions, making American movies, serving in the American government, and working in America's universities, there would be an effort by the United States to root these people out as much as possible, and you can bet your 2 front teeth that there would certainly be a overreaction as there was with McCarthyism. So basically, by this point, this information is awful. The spy who was working with the Soviet Union, who had got with the Rosenbergs, Alger Hiss, is executed, as are the Rosenbergs. And it is one of the most shocking stories of American secrets being leaked to the world. And the judge who condemned the Rosenbergs basically said, being murdered, being killed under the law is too good a punishment for you for the devastation that you have potentially wrought. At that point, the idea of nuclear war first enters into the lexicon, because now the Soviets, ahead of schedule, have nuclear weapons, and they can use them. And we don't know if they want to use them or not. Stalin has proven to be totally duplicitous, totally dictatorial, and the more and more information is coming out about just how awful life is in the Soviet Union. Now, the Americans are not very good at explaining to their own people or educating them about why communism has so many problems in the Soviet Union and then later on in China. There's just this assumption that it's standing against everything you stand for, therefore it's evil. But they don't go into enough description as to what this is. Obviously, one of the biggest fears is that communism is godless and atheistic, and that is why Americans in the 1950s, in order to counter the Soviets, add the very implied phrase, "In God we trust," to our currency and the Pledge of Allegiance. If you ever hear a clip of the Pledge of Allegiance read in the 1940s, you will not hear on one nation under God. It was added later on because of the Cold War. And in God we trust wasn't on the currency. It was a doubling down of America's Judeo-Christian origins as a way to stand up against the Bolsheviks. Now, moving forward. So, things are not looking great if you're the Allies. Yes, you've been able to stabilize Western Europe, and yes, you create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to make sure you have mutual defense, mutual trade, and mutual support, NATO in 1949, but the Soviets have the eastern half of Europe, and now they have China, and Mao Zedong gets very cozy with Joseph Stalin. Now, Mao has had to revise communist doctrines and ideas to apply to a more agrarian society in China, basically turning the haves and the have-nots of the bourgeoisie and proletariat of Marx and Lenin into the farmers and the ruling class in China. the emperor, the nationalists. Those are the ruling class. Those are the enemy. The United States is very quick to support Chiang Kai-shek and the Taiwanese government, and still does so to this day. That is why one of the biggest foreign policy concerns for the United States 75 years later is the safety of Taiwan and the fear that China will take Taiwan whenever it wants. Now, things have gotten a little bit less tense between the United States and China, but obviously there's actually face-to-face combat between the United States and China and not the Soviet Union. By the way, before I go any further, the reason this is called the Cold War, as I'm sure many of you already know, is because it is a hot war, is where you are literally sending your armies against each other and fighting and killing each other in battles. A Cold War is where you are not fighting explicitly against each other, but you are fighting ideologically, militarily, technologically, not militarily, ideologically, technologically, through espionage and spy tactics. You are basically trying to outdo each other economically, socially, militarily. You're trying to prove you're the best. And you are trying to influence everyone else around you to join your side and to get their weapons from you, get their economy from you, get their governments from you. And so it's an ideological battle, but it is not ever a military head-on battle. Now, of course, there are Soviets giving weapons to the Vietnamese when the United States are fighting in Vietnam, and to the Koreans when the United States are fighting in Korea, and the United States is giving weapons to the Afghanis when the Soviets invade Afghanistan in the 1980s. So there's obviously indirect fighting between these two sides, but there's really no head-on military fight. There is the fear, and there are plans for a world war between the United States and the Soviet Union at any time, but the growing number of nuclear weapons, which eventually become nuclear missiles that can travel over different continents, so they are called ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the growing fear of launching a nuclear missile to Moscow and one being launched back at New York or Washington, D.C., and destroying everybody all over the world, because you have hundreds of these by the late 50s and early 60s, leads to fear, basically could be a deterrent to World War, because World War could involve nuclear holocaust where 80 to 90% of the population is destroyed and most of the world is sent back into the Stone Ages. So that is a definite fear and perhaps a deterrent from a land war. Without nuclear weapons, it's quite possible, and this is what President Dwight Eisenhower of the Americans in the 1950s basically believed. Without nuclear weapons, there would be the possibility of a large land war in Asia or Eastern Europe that he didn't want to get involved in, that would have caused millions of deaths and would have been World War IV. So that's obviously a fear and a concern. But obviously, in 1949, the bigger problem that happens is that the North Koreans the next problem that happens is North Korea invades South Korea, getting weapons and support from both China and the Soviet Union. The United States responds by using Japan as their base of operations to invade under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, and this leads to the Korean War starting in 1950. And for 3 years, there's this back and forth fighting between the United States and North Korea, and the South Koreans, and other allies are involved too, like Britain and Canada. Now, the war goes pretty well for the United States at first because MacArthur is willing to take risks and invade North Korea rather than fight all of the war in the South. But China sends 1 million fighting men, so there's actually direct fighting between Chinese communists and Americans during the Korean War. And basically, MacArthur wanting to invade China and potentially use nuclear weapons on them gets President Truman extremely worried about the loss of huge amounts of life, and he dismisses MacArthur from the position. The war carries on until the end of Truman's administration, and eventually a stalemate is agreed upon where the original 38th parallel line is used to distinguish between North Korea and South Korea, and there is an area where that neither side occupies called the demilitarized zone that still exists to this day. So the Korean War is a great example of the Korean War is a great example of what Cold War fighting is like. The Soviets were doing everything in their power to help the North Koreans and the Chinese defeat the Americans, while the Americans were fighting on the ground to stop the Soviets. The Soviets will do similar things when they invade places like Afghanistan. Meanwhile, how are the Eastern European countries doing? Well, you've got Hungary, which is really starting to struggle, and in 1956 they have a revolution against the Soviet rule. This is going to lead to problems. They basically beg the Americans to come and help them, and the United States is is tempted to do it, but they do not want to invade Eastern Europe. They do not want all-out war with the Soviets, and they do not want nuclear war. So the United States basically lets Hungary suffer as Soviet tanks run in, and Hungary is overwhelmed by and the revolution is crushed, and its leaders are killed. In 1953, Stalin dies and is replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who wants to take a more open-minded approach to the Cold War and doesn't want to be as aggressive as his predecessor. He actually, in the Soviet Union, starts to talk about reforming and condemning Stalin's works and writing about the problems that happened in the revolution and being openly critical of the communist past so that they can create a better communist future. But as this starts to happen, he starts to become more and more repressive. And as time goes on, he becomes more and more militaristic and aggressive. And suppressing the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 is the first example of this. So that's what's going. So in Asia, you've got China, you've got the Koreas divided. In 1954, the Vietnamese defeat the French at the Battle of Bien Dinh Phu is one of the greatest defeats in French history, and France pulls out of the war. The United States props up a South Vietnamese government that was not elected, basically trying to redo Korea, where there's a free South, free in quotation marks, and a democratic South and a communist North. However, the North Vietnamese, along with allies in the South called the Viet Cong, won't stand for this. And with the help of China and the Soviet Union, again, other communist governments coming to their aid, they invade the South, and this causes the Vietnam War, which will last for 20 years. And the United States is going to be involved in some capacity over the next 20 years. So you have Khrushchev, you have the Hungarian Revolution, you have the beginnings of the Vietnam War, you have the United States involved in its fingers in many pies. I'm not even going to be able to get to all of the overthrowings of different governments in the Congo and in Africa, throughout Central and Latin America, where basically the United States will do everything in its power to uplift governments, even very shady governments, although not all of them were very shady, dictatorial, repressive, even fascistic, or military governments, in order to keep communism from coming to power in those areas because they are so enamored with their fight against the Soviets. For instance, Juan Perón is upheld by the United States government, despite the fact that he is a brutal fascist dictator, because he is not a Marxist. He is an anti-Marxist. Franco, again, is an example of this. Another man who was upheld by the United States government because he was an anti-Marxist and because he was good for American business was Fulgencio Batista, the general dictator, governor, whatever you want to call him, president of Cuba in the late 1950s. Now, Batista had actually overseen a period of economic growth for the small island nation just 100 miles south of Florida. And basically, he had been very sympathetic to the United States and was very anti-communist. His government he was promising free and fair elections, but there was a big sense amongst a lot of the Cuban people that this would not happen, that Batista, if he lost these free and fair elections, would just seize power because he had the military in his grasp and take over Cuba and make it a dictatorship, a military fascist dictatorship, paralleling perhaps Juan Perón. So there's a lot of huge worries about this. And a big worry and a big opportunity is seen by the communist guerrilla war fighters in Cuba, led by a man named Fidel Castro. Now, Castro is a murderer who has been forced to flee the island multiple times. He's an insurrectionist. He's brutal. He's determined. He's handsome. He's charismatic. He's brave. And if he's not brave, he gives off the feelings of bravado to those around him, and he's a renegade. And he is trying to foment as much communist uprising in Central and Latin America as he possibly can do in South America, and of course in Cuba. And he's eventually able to return to Cuba in the late 1950s. He stages several unsuccessful insurrections until he finally succeeds at the beginning of 1959 in overthrowing Batista's government. Many of the upper-class Cubans, worried about communist retribution from below, flee the island and go to Florida. And that becomes a common trend over the next 65 years and continues to this day, where many Cubans seek to flee their island and go to the United States, particularly Florida, and that's why Florida has such a large Cuban population. So, basically, Cuba, which is right next to the United States, in 1959 becomes a communist government, and instantly Castro becomes close friends with Nikita Khrushchev. This terrifies the United States. This is a worst nightmare come true. because the United States is nowhere close to the Soviet Union. They are nowhere close where they can launch planes, missiles, and forces just from an island nation right next to the Soviet Union. They are not in Poland. They are not in the Transcaucasus region. They are not in Finland. They really can't get there. So they're very worried about what to do. And this is a big problem for the Eisenhower administration and then his successor, President John F. Kennedy, who comes to power in 1961. Now, interestingly enough, before I get to that, as Castro is buddying up with Nikita Khrushchev, who Soviet supplies, weapons, and economic aid, foreign aid, is basically going to sustain Cuba for the next 30 years. At the same time as this is happening, China and the Soviet Union are growing apart. Mao, who is instituting his Great Leap Forward and his communist ideals throughout China, which will lead to a lot of problems, a lot of progress, but a lot of problems, feels that Khrushchev is a weak man, that he's a traitor to the real communist revolution, that he doesn't invoke Marxist-Leninism or Stalinism, and which he has already rejected anyways, and he feels that Khrushchev is a cheap knockoff of Stalin, and he wants nothing to do with him. So during the 1960s, the Soviet Union and China are going to grow more and more apart, and there's actually going to be fighting on the border of China and Russia in the late 1960s, and the United States will later capitalize on this as a way to weaken the Soviet Union. So basically, in 1961, a new American president comes to the scene, John F. Kennedy. Kennedy is young, he's telegenic, he's very good looking, and he knows how to talk. But Khrushchev thinks that he is weak and easily manipulated. And Khrushchev, who just a year ago gave a speech at the UN where he basically banged his shoe on the podium and said, "We will bury you," promising to destroy the United States and the West, and Western democracy, Western liberalism, all of those things. Khrushchev feels that Kennedy is weak enough and manipulative and can manipulate him. So in order to get control of all of Berlin, returning to Central Europe and Eastern Europe, he forms a wall to separate Eastern and Western Berlin. A big problem that was happening for the East German communist government, and a problem that was foreseen in the Soviet Union and throughout most of Eastern Europe and these communist governments, is that people, especially in Eastern Germany and in the eastern part of Berlin, were trying to escape to West Berlin and West Germany. And they would so people would visit their family members. They'd go from East Berlin to West Berlin, and in getting to West Berlin, they would find ways to get to West Germany, which West Berlin is, again, squarely in East Germany, but it is ruled by the West German Democratic Government, which is, again, set up by the United States. So Germany is divided in half, Berlin is divided in half, the Soviets and the East Germans are getting really tired of East Berliners fleeing into the West and using ways to get away. They don't see much of this problem in the converse with the United States and the Europeans being upset that West Berliners are going to East Germany. However, there are East Berliners going to West Germany. And so in 1961, Khrushchev sets up a series of fortifications and defenses, including barbed wire, barricades, blockades, a wall, and troops, soldiers, and sentries who will shoot people who are trying to escape. And this becomes known as the Berlin Wall, closing off East and West Berlin from each other. This is a huge sign of Soviet control over the Eastern Bloc countries and over East Germany and East Berlin, and seems as a huge affront to the freedoms and free choices of the people of Eastern Germany and East Berlin. Now, just real fast, in order to counter NATO, in the late 50s, the Soviet Union had set up what was called the Warsaw Pact, which included all of their eastern countries, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, which had communist governments, Poland, and East Germany. And that was a series of mutual defense pacts, economic aid, things like that, similar to NATO. It's their version of NATO. So now you have Berlin divided by a wall. President Kennedy goes to Berlin and gives a speech where he says in a very heavy Bostonian accent, "I am a Berliner." And in saying this, he is basically, and yes, Jacob, you are absolutely right. Simon the Bunny is one of the best. And I hope you guys are enjoying what you're hearing. I hope you guys are enjoying learning about the Cold War. I don't know if I'm going to get to Ellis Island, but heck, there's so much on that great island and its importance in the history of American immigration that it might be worth an entire hour of its own next Sunday. We'll see. So basically, back to where I was. So Berlin is separated by a wall, and this is going to be the case for almost 30 more years. You are going, and so Khrushchev has basically shown Kennedy to be weak, and shown the West to be weak, and thinks that he can do whatever he wants, and he thinks he can pressure Kennedy to allow Berlin to become part of East Germany, and there is no free West Berlin. So this is an issue for Kennedy at this time. The Cold War is going to consume most of Kennedy's presidency. Now, the speech doesn't do anything to stop the wall from getting built, but it does unite the world in this cause of tearing down the Berlin Wall. But by the 1970s and 80s, most people believe that the Berlin Wall will never come down. So back to the United States. Kennedy is facing more military pressure to send more and more forces, more and more military advisors, more and more strategists, more and more weapons and aid to the South Vietnamese government, which is constantly under pressure from two things. One, its own popularity because it's extremely corrupt, and two, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in the South fighting to bring South Vietnam into the folds of the North Vietnamese government. So Kennedy is under pressure there. That's a big problem. There's continual revolutions in Central America and in Africa that are the United States and the Soviet Union are both trying to influence in one way or another. At the same time, the under pressure from the United States, which fears that it cannot argue that it is a free and democratic country that wants people to be free if it continues to allow imperialism. Britain and France, again, under pressure from the United States, which wants to look good on the world stage, is letting go of its colonies in Africa, which it's controlled for decades. And because of this decolonization, there's power vacuums, and the fear of the American government is that communism will rise to power in several areas. Congo is a great example of this. And in these power vacuums, you have the rise of some communist governments, some socialist governments, and a lot of kleptocracies, military governments, dictatorships, and Africa is going to become a political mess in the next 20 years as the Europeans, especially the British and the French, decolonize, and the Soviet Union and the Americans fight with each other through espionage and spy tactics to overthrow governments that they don't think are amenable to them. Now, a common historical perspective that historians love to point out is how the United States interfered and overthrew these duly elected communist governments. But let's not pretend that the Soviets weren't trying to do the same thing. You have spy groups on both sides, the NKVD, which becomes the KGB, versus the CIA, doing everything in their power to influence governments throughout the world to become either more communistic or less communistic. And so Africa is going to be this hodgepodge of different socialist, communist, and non-socialist communist governments. Basically, all of them, to a large extent, are run by dictators that are either propped up by the United States or propped up by the Soviet Union. And the Cubans and the Chinese are also going to try to influence governments to become communistic. There are countries that are independent of communism, that are of the Soviet Union's influence, that are communist. In the 1960s, China becomes this way, as does Yugoslavia and Albania, which basically are going to turn on Khrushchev, although Yugoslavia has been basically an independent communist government since the end of World War II under their dictator, Joseph Tito, who hates Stalin and wants nothing to do with the Cold War. So there are democratic countries like Austria and Austria that remain pretty much independent and neutral during the Cold War, and there are communist governments like Yugoslavia that remain independent during the Cold War as well. Interesting side note. So in 1960, there's Vietnam, there's Africa, there's a lot going on. And Kennedy is under a lot of pressure from the intelligence community and the community of the military, from the Pentagon, from the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about that is growing in influence, power, and wealth as the Cold War progresses. In fact, the military chapters of both the United States and the Soviet Union are beefed up to an extreme. And again, you have a growing number of nuclear missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles that can destroy cities in short amounts of time and can threaten the entire safety, not just of the Soviet Union and the United States, but Europe and Asia. So what happens next? So Khrushchev decides to go after Kennedy a little bit harder. He puts in nuclear missiles, and some of them are duds, in Cuba, right off the coast of the United States, pointing out that there are American nuclear missiles in Turkey, which is not far from the Soviet Union. Turkey is a NATO ally and member. I think they're the only Muslim majority country that is part of NATO at this point. And so there's obviously this double standard where the United States has nuclear missiles close to the Soviet Union. Why shouldn't the Soviet Union have them close to the United States? President Kennedy refusing to tolerate this, basically sets up a blockade around the island of Cuba. And this comes after Kennedy botched support for an invasion of Cuban nationalists who wanted to retake the island from Castro, called the Bay of Pigs. So Kennedy has seemed very weak with the Berlin Wall and with the Bay of Pigs, but now he's not going to be weak anymore. He's going to surround the island and do everything in his power to stop the Soviets. And basically a blockade ensues, and there's this question of nuclear war, and both sides are very close to launching nuclear missiles. And eventually, the fear of dying, basically, allows both sides to give in and start communicating a little bit more. And from there, the tensions of the Cold War, which have reached an apex, will start to slowly simmer down in the next 20 years. So what happens is there's a hotline that's established, a phone with a direct connection from the Kremlin, where the general secretary, the leader of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union is, to the President of the United States and the White House. So there's a lot going on there. So Kennedy has actually acted decisively enough to deal with this. And there are two more issues that Kennedy is dealing with in order to try to get the United States to win the Cold War. One of them is the creation of the Peace Corps, which he believes will be an international organization that will be run by the United States, that will be able to send aid to certain areas, help, and give proper, be it humanitarian aid, financial aid, investment, just give opportunities to those who are suffering, and to bring relief and medical attention, nutrition, whatever is needed to certain areas of the world, as a way to show the benevolence of the United States and of democratic countries, and the good and the way that Americans fight for the good of all people from all different parts of the world. So that's going to become a big part of Kennedy's agenda during the end of his presidency. Now, another thing that's going on that I haven't talked about enough is a less dramatic, although very interesting and intense in its own way, race in the Cold War. Now, there's obviously an economic competition, there's an arms competition, there's a political influence competition, which we can see with the Vietnam War, Cuba, and the Korean War, but there's also a technological competition going on between these two sides. Not only are they both trying to get their best bombs, they're also trying to develop the best technology, the best cars, the best electrical units, the best houses, everything, the best art. They're trying to outdo each other in every single field. One of the ways they're trying to outdo each other is in the skies, and that leads to the space race. In 1957, shocking the entire world, the Soviets send a satellite into space called Sputnik. Sputnik 1, which becomes the name of their space program, is the first satellite launched into space by any country in the world. The Soviets take the advantage in what becomes known as the space race. Then they send the first animal into space. First it was a fly, but in another mission it was a dog named Laika that they send into space. So they are sending several satellites and shuttles into space, and they've already sent an animal in 1957. And in 1958, they send the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. And this is the first man ever sent into orbit, and they have the huge, overwhelming advantage in the space race. So the United States knows that it's fallen behind, and so in 1959, President Dwight Eisenhower establishes the National Aeronautic Air and Space Administration, NASA, which will work tirelessly to catch up. President Kennedy in 1963 basically says that he wants to get a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and NASA is working tirelessly to make this happen. And the United States does play catch-up pretty well. In 1961, they send Alan Shepard, their first man into space, and in 1962, they send John Glenn, who becomes the first man to orbit the world. So that's going on. Meanwhile, the Soviets also send the first woman into space, Claudia Shevchenko, I believe in 1966. I'm not sure. But basically, both sides will continue going back and forth with each other on the space race and on space technology, trying to show which side is best, until the United States gets the first man on the moon with Neil Armstrong in 1969, fulfilling Kennedy's promise of doing it by the end of the decade. And the Soviet Union basically says, well, that doesn't matter. All that matters is who can get to Mars first. Neither side obviously got to Mars, so the United States basically, in retrospect, won the space race of the Cold War. Kennedy is assassinated at the end of 1963. He is succeeded by his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who the American military industrial complex will influence with their theory of a domino theory of Southeastern Asia falling, not just Vietnam, but Cambodia and Laos to communism. And they will send, he will ramp up and escalate starting in 1965 America's involvement in the Vietnam War, and this will lead to a lot of tensions and disagreements in the United States as cultural divides, generational divides start to come to fruition as the younger generation is not as gung-ho more and more to fight in the war and die for the United States, especially in a war that they don't see the point of. Corrupt governments in South Vietnam being supported by the United States doesn't make sense to a lot of young people. Young people start to turn on the United States. Some of them even embrace communism and Maoism as a form of rebellion. There's a rise of a counterculture that in the mainstream is not radicalized, that wants to end the war. They want free speech. They want more rights for women. They obviously are fighting for civil rights for African Americans and the end of segregation. So there are cultural movements and phenomenons, especially amongst young people in the United States in the 1960s, that start to supplant a lot of the anti-communist, the overtly, staunchly anti-communist platform of American domestic and cultural life that had existed since the end of World War II. And so this new generation, the boomer generation, many of them born during the baby boom coming at the end of World War II, are going to turn on American foreign policy, especially with the Vietnam War, and are going to insist on radical changes for the roles of women, minorities, and the role of America in the world, obviously seeing the Vietnam War as a stupid and lost cause. The media is going to join in on them in some attempt. The use of a television for the first time in a major conflict, and the commentary of Walter Cronkite, who is seen as a mainstream man, who is of the older generation, but is very critical of the war, will start to turn American public opinion against the war and start to see it more and more as an unwinnable war. Not because the United States is overwhelmed and doesn't have enough supplies to deal with the Chinese, Soviets, and their help to the North Vietnamese. It's because guerrilla warfare tactics and the use of the many jungles and different areas of Vietnam, the different topography and climate of Vietnam against the American forces proves to be very successful. And guerrilla warfare tactics, just like it had done to the French, tend to eviscerate the Americans and the South Vietnamese. Also, a lack of passion from the South Vietnamese army, the corruption of the militaristic dictatorships in South Vietnam, and the efforts of the Viet Cong to destabilize South Vietnam make the United States' efforts and job all the more hard. Of course, Johnson does not want to go over the top and invade the North because he doesn't want the Soviet Union and China to get involved in this war, just like Korea. So the war, unlike the Korean War, which was partly fought or mostly fought in North Korea, this war is mainly fought in the South. So Johnson, despite a lot of domestic reforms that are very popular in the United States, becomes more and more unpopular for his handling of the Vietnam conflict, and he eventually drops out of the presidential race in 1968. And in one of the most tumultuous years in American history, which deserves an hour of its own for description, Richard Nixon wins the election. He is Eisenhower's vice president and a staunch anti-communist who has come back from the political grave to become president of the United States. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, things are not, despite all of these problems with American culture, despite all of these problems in Vietnam, things aren't great in the Soviet Union either. Economic stagnation is starting to set in. The standards of living are nowhere near what they are in the West, even in countries that are significantly poorer than the United States. Compared to France, the Soviet Union is far behind France, which is behind the United States. So there's a huge deficit compared to the United States when it comes to the standard of living. But there isn't a huge deficit when it comes to military spending. The Soviets actually have a bigger and stronger military with more nuclear weapons in the 1970s than the United States does. So Khrushchev is seen as weak, especially after the failure of the Cuban Missile Crisis to get more from the Americans. And he's pushed out of power, and he is succeeded by a man named Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev is going to rely more on the different Soviet communist committees, so he's going to have less power than Khrushchev and Stalin did. But he's going to be a more hardline traditional communist. Kind of a mini Stalin is how I've always seen him. Brezhnev is aggressive, he's assertive, he's very militaristic and oppressive. He represses a lot of the freedoms and opportunities and rights that Khrushchev had flirted with giving the people. And Brezhnev is not seen as friendly to the United States or not open to talking, especially early on in his regime. In 1968, in Czechoslovakia, there are uprisings against the communist government, which is called the Prague Spring, led by Alexander Dubček, who basically wants to create what he calls socialism with a human face, where socialism and communism are not nearly as repressive as they've been in the past. Brezhnev does not stand for this, and just like with Hungary 12 years earlier, the Soviets invade and send tanks into Czechoslovakia. This earns, just as the Hungarian Revolution did, international scorn, especially from the United States, but Brezhnev doesn't care. Dubček is thrown out of power, many people are killed, and the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia as it was known then, modern-day Czech Republic and Slovakia, remain stalwart parts of the Eastern Bloc. The Soviets, at the meantime, are starting to see a greater divide with China, and Mao is going to reassert his power in the late 1960s and brutally repress and purge his political enemies in what's called the Cultural Revolution, which is going to cost, as a lot of Mao's policies did, millions of lives. Yes, and Simon is correct today, and I will get to that. The Velvet Revolution, speaking of the Czech Republic, the Velvet and Slovakia. The Velvet Revolution began on this day in 1989 when the Czechoslovakians began their revolution against the communists and against the Soviet Union. But anyways, so getting back to it, Brezhnev isn't really willing to deal until Nixon comes on the scene. Now, Nixon does two interesting things in his presidency in the early 1970s. One, by the way, today is the anniversary when Richard Nixon, in the midst of the Watergate scandal, said, "I am not a crook," as well, Simon. But Nixon does two interesting things. He aggressively asserts trying to stabilize South Vietnam by bombing North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Also at this time, Cambodia has a communist revolution, as does Laos. And Cambodia is taken over by a man named Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge is going to be extremely aggressive, extremely violent, and extremely repressive, and they're going to cause a genocide of 2 million people, which is, by proportion, and the 20th century has tons of genocides, unfortunately, by proportion, the Cambodian genocide of the Killing Fields is the largest proportional genocide in human history, meaning the largest proportion of the population of Cambodia was killed, larger than the Soviet Union, larger than Mao, larger than the Holocaust. It's an absolutely brutal thing, and it only happened in 3 years. It gets so bad that by the late 70s, fun fact, the Cambodian communist government is overthrown and Pot is sent into exile by the Vietnamese communists who are horrified by these actions. It was about a third of their population is destroyed. It's an atrocious historical tragedy. So Nixon's efforts are going to have mixed results. But by 1973, the United States is able to withdraw most of its military presence from Vietnam, and Nixon is basically able to say, in some agreement, that the United States did win the war. Basically, the North Vietnamese allow the South Vietnamese to have a government, and the United States pulls out its military while still having aid, humanitarians, and some small paramilitary presence in Vietnam for the next couple of years. Yeah, I shouldn't have called it a fun fact, Steph. It's not a fun fact. Sad fact, but interesting. So that's the first thing he's going to do. The second thing he's going to do is he's going to surprise everybody. Nixon is known as a staunch anti-communist. He was part of HUAC. He was known for being a cold warrior, as they called them in the 1950s, fighting actively to destroy the communist influence in the United States and root out spies in Hollywood and academia and in politics. But Nixon's going to do something incredible. He's going to go across the aisle to the communists. In 1972, Richard Nixon becomes the first American president to visit China. And he's not visiting a free democratic country. He's not visiting Taiwan. He's visiting communist China. And in visiting communist China, he meets with Mao, who is severely disabled by this time, and with other government officials. I'm trying to remember the name of him. Is it Deng Fo is his name? I'm trying to remember. He takes over after Mao, and he actually he meets with Mao's second in command, who will later take over and start to modernize China and take it away, at least economically, from communist policies. So Nixon basically normalizes relations with communist China. He says, under the care of Mao Zedong, the lives of the people of communist China have improved greatly, which either is totally ignorant or a lie, Or maybe there is some truth to it, but basically Nixon plays the game and appeases the Chinese. And the Soviets are horrified by this because not only have they grown apart from the Chinese, where the Chinese basically think they're weak knockoff communists and not the real communists, but now they're talking with the United States and they're starting to normalize relations. They're starting to talk about economic ties with each other. They're starting to talk about the United States recognizing that China has a right to have a communist government. This is a huge affront. Deng Xiaoping, yes, Deng Xiaoping succeeds Mao, and during the 1970s and 80s will try to make China more economically closer to the West. But basically, this is horrifying news to the Soviet Union, so Brezhnev decides to deal. He goes to the table and starts talking about arms negotiations and what becomes known as the SALT I Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And Nixon is able to start it and basically complete it. But then he, due to a scandal, leaves power, and he's replaced by American President Gerald Ford. Ford and Nixon and Jimmy Carter, the next American president after that, will work with Brezhnev in a policy of what becomes known as détente. Basically, both sides decide they're going to stop bickering as much, and they're going to let each other do what they want. You fish on your side, we fish on our side. You can have your free hand to do communism the way you want. We can have our free hand to do capitalism the way we want. This is going to be the motif for the next 10 years or so. It's not going to work. And the Soviets make these strategic arms agreements and then violate all of them. And there isn't really any sort of accountability. There's just kind of this trust between the United States and the Soviet Union that's built in the late 1970s. But basically, you have the Soviet Union still facing economic decline. The United States is having some economic problems. They have the energy crisis of the late 70s. Meanwhile, communists in Iran are trying to overthrow the government of the repressive dictator, the Shah, who once again was protected by the United States because he was an anti-communist. And they're going to be these communists are going to be co-opted by radical Muslims to overthrow the Shah, Reza Pahlavi's regime in Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in 1979, and Iran is going to become a radical Islamic government, as it is to this day. And the Soviets are going to be embarrassed by that because they try to help form a communist revolution. Also in 1979, with a communist government basically about to fall apart in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. This is going to be an embarrassing war that will last for 10 years. It will expose the weaknesses of the Soviet military, and the Soviets are not able to keep a communist government stable. It is their Vietnam, but their system is far closer to collapsing after it than the American system. So now we're into the final full decade of the Cold War. And I don't want to stop, so I'm going to keep going because I don't want that'd be a weird place to break up. But basically, you have the American presidents being more open to the idea of wheeling and dealing with the Soviet Union and letting the Soviet Union do their own thing. Jimmy Carter, the U.S. president in the late 70s, is horrified by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, so he boycotts the Moscow Olympics of 1980, which allows the Soviets to win all of the gold medals, which obviously the Olympics has become a battlefield between who's better athletically and culturally, the Soviets or the Americans. So that's not good either, at least for the Americans. In 1980, Carter has had a lot of problems. Obviously, the fall of Iran, the American hostages taken Iran, a bad economy, an energy crisis, gas prices. All of these things are really devastating Carter's administration, and he loses in a landslide to probably the most important American president that I have talked about so far, Ronald Reagan. Why is Reagan so important? Well, Reagan, obviously, I am not trying to praise Reagan upside down and backwards. Reagan had plenty of problems, but Reagan has a different approach than Nixon, Ford, and Carter. Reagan, a conservative, basically believes that the Soviet Union doesn't deserve to exist. He believes that the Soviet Union should be brought to its knees, and if the United States could have an economic surge, that it could emphasize both its own domestic policies as well as its military. And the United States could build its military and economy at the same rate. The Soviets could only build their military. So basic commodities can be available and weapons can be available in the United States. The Soviet Union can only do one or the other. So Reagan intensifies military spending. He arms the United States. He starts building up nuclear weapons again. And the Soviets, who have been doing this on the sly, are horrified and a little bit scared of this. Reagan also basically tries to stop communism wherever it goes. So in 1983, a small communist revolution happens on the very small island of Grenada, and Reagan isn't going to stand for it. He sends in the U.S. Special Forces and overthrows the communist government, basically saying communism, not only we will stop communism, we won't let it get anywhere. And oftentimes Reagan does this without caring about the feelings of the people of those native lands. A great example of this is in Nicaragua in the late 80s, when Reagan seeking to, defeat the Sandinistas, which were a communist group led by Daniel Ortega, starts to aid these people called the Contras. And he aids the Contras by getting weapons from Iran, who is an enemy of the United States since their Islamic revolution in the late 70s. This becomes a scandal that hurts Reagan's presidency and legacy. But Reagan is committed to stopping communism, and he gets some friends at this time that are going to help him. One of the biggest examples is Margaret Thatcher from Great Britain. Thatcher is a very strong anti-communist. She is going to roll back England's progress towards more socially liberal and economically liberal policy. She's going to end social democracy in Great Britain and take it back to more capitalistic, free market policies. And she's going to be a staunch anti-communist as well, and basically want to support Reagan throughout most of his endeavors. At the same time, there's a new pope. For centuries, the Pope had been from Italy. This Pope is from Poland. He is the first Pope from Poland. I'm trying to remember the name of his name, his Polish name. But he is Pope John Paul II. And John Paul II is a Polish man. Poland is a communist country. Communism has done a lot to repress religious rights throughout most of its history. What will a Pope from Poland say? The Catholic Church has been staunchly anti-communist since communism's founding, since the founding of the first socialist government in the Soviet Union in 1917. The Soviet Union has been condemned multiple times by the Vatican. What will happen now that a communist country has a pope representing it? Well, John Paul II gives a huge speech in Poland, I think in Krakow, in 1981, and with 6 million people attending or watching, which is 1/6 of the population of Poland, he condemns communism, says that it's wrong, and demands that the Polish people overthrow it and that it stop. This is horrifying to Brezhnev and the Soviets. And now there's starting to be cracks in the Eastern Bloc, in that Iron Curtain. There's starting to be tears in the curtain. The Poles are also influenced heavily by a man named Lech Walesa, who leads a group called Solidarity. And with a nod of the cap to today's anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, Václav Havel, a poet and playwright, who's going to start leading an anti-communist movement in Czechoslovakia. There are anti-communist movements all throughout Eastern Europe, and they are gaining in influence and power. You have Thatcher, you have John Paul II, you have Reagan, you have Helmut Kohl, the West German chancellor, who's going to really promote a strong capitalistic government. So basically, these different governments, for better or for worse, are going to double down on their capitalism and double down on their anti-communist rhetoric. Reagan doesn't mince words. They ask him, what do you think of the Soviet Union? And he says, it is an evil empire that need be destroyed. And they said, what is your goal for dealing with the Soviet Union? Rather than talking about stabilization, good relations, Reagan quite bravely, although possibly quite recklessly, says, we win, they lose. Reagan also gives a press conference where he hilariously, although quite ridiculously, says, we launched the missiles a few minutes ago. And probably what he is lampooned most for during his presidency, he proposes a interstellar laser system called the Strategic Defense Initiative that he basically proposes that the United States build a series of lasers in the sky that will shoot down Soviet missiles, basically rendering the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal worthless. This terrifies the Soviets. Reagan has no idea how this is going to work. Reagan is not a scientist. The United States doesn't have the technology for that. It probably doesn't have it today either. But Reagan kind of bluffs a little bit. He's an actor. He's known as the great communicator, and he communicates that to them. And the Soviets are interested in at least getting the technology from SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, which the American public lampoons him by calling it Star Wars. But the fear of missiles in space that could shoot down, or lasers in space that could shoot down their missiles, really worries the Soviet Union. In 1982, Brezhnev dies. He's succeeded by a man named Andropov, who dies right after that, and then another guy, Khrushchev, who dies right after that. And in 1984, the final leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, comes to power. Gorbachev is a younger Soviet. He is far less interested in repressing people's rights, and he becomes interested in opening up better communications with the West. He meets with Reagan at several places. Reykjavik, I'm trying to remember where else they met in Switzerland, and they basically tried to do their best to come to some sort of understanding of how to reduce the number of nuclear weapons and also better relations between their two countries. On his own home front, Gorbachev creates two new political strategies. One is called Glasnost, which is a reforming of the old ways, where basically there's more free speech allowed, there's more criticism of the government allowed, there's less political dissent suppressed. Throughout most of its history, the Soviet Union had dissidents like Yuri Andropov and Boris Pasternak and Alexander Solzhenitsyn fleeing the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev basically is going to roll back this idea that basically people can criticize the government and not be afraid of dying, being thrown in a prison called a gulag, or having to flee. And he's basically going to say that in order to save the communist revolution, they're going to have to stop being as what has traditionally been understood as hardcore communists. The old generations have gotten it wrong, and we need to be a little bit more open about the way we talk about our government, and communism doesn't say there can't be free speech. He also is going to invest in perestroika, which is economic reform, in order to get even keeled with the United States, which is experiencing a level of economic prosperity along with a level of military building that is starting to terrify the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev and Reagan continue to work through these details, and then one of the most significant events of the entire Cold War happens in 1987. In 1987, Reagan goes to Berlin, just like Kennedy did 26 years later. And amid growing tensions and a growing feeling that the Cold War is starting to turn in favor towards the United States and the Western allies, Reagan gives an extremely famous speech where he says, "If you value freedom, Mr. Gorbachev, you will come to this gate. Open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It is one of the most well-known speeches in world history. It is extremely effective, and Gorbachev now finds himself under pressure. The Eastern European communist governments find themselves under pressure. And when an all-out revolt starts in Poland in 1989, Gorbachev chooses not to send in the Soviet army. When an all-out revolution begins soon afterwards, the Velvet Revolution that started on this day in Czechoslovakia, Gorbachev again doesn't send in the Soviet army. And by this point, it becomes ultimately clear that communism is starting to fall apart in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev basically returns to the pre-World War II policy of Stalin of keeping communism in the Soviet Union. We are at a huge crux here. In 1989, the East German government passes a resolution where they basically allow for the free and safe passage of people from the eastern part of the country to the western part of the country. They pass this at about 11:30 at night. People run out into the streets, misinterpreting this law, take shovels and hammers, and start destroying the Berlin Wall. And the wall comes down. And by this point, Reagan is out of power, and the American president is the former head of the CIA, George Herbert Walker Bush, or as they called him back then, George Bush. And he will be the last American president of the Cold War. And Bush continues to work along Reagan's foreign policy lines and basically believes that now there is a space for normalization of relations. The Soviet Union and the Cold War are seemingly coming to an end. Gorbachev is trying to hold on to power and keep communism alive in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Poland, with its trade union Solidarity and Lech Walesa, froze out the communist government, and Walesa becomes president. Václav Havel becomes the president of Czechoslovakia. Hungary becomes independent, and East and West Germany in 1990 are reunited into one entity. And so now you see the Cold War is finally coming to an end. The Soviet Union ends its war in Afghanistan in I think either 1988 or 1989 with atrocious results. The Chernobyl nuclear meltdown in 1986 showed how weak the Soviet infrastructure really was. And hardline communists in the government are very upset with Gorbachev for being so soft. They try to overthrow him in August of 1991. He is returned to power briefly, but on Christmas Eve, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev steps down. He gives up power, and in resigning, he basically says this is the end of the general secretaries, and the Soviet Union is quickly dissolved and over the next couple of years, all of these Baltic countries like Latvia and Lithuania, the Ukraine, Belarus are going to become independent countries from Russia, which will become the Russian Federation under its new leader, Boris Yeltsin. So 75 years after it began, the Soviet Union ends. And also, 45 years after it began, the Cold War comes to an end. And the West has won. At least this is the official story. This is the general story, for all intents and purposes. This is seen by a lot of people, perhaps mistakenly, as the victory of the West, or the victory of capitalism over socialism. And it seems as though the Soviet Union's collapse was inevitable. But obviously, Gorbachev's efforts to stabilize his country did perhaps do that, and he could have perhaps continued. But such antagonism about betraying communist principles by hardliners in the party who saw him as weak eventually lead to his complete decay and collapse. And so there you have it. I know it took me more than an hour to tell it, but that is a brief, yes, believe it or not, that's a brief and a bridge. There is a lot more that happens that I can't even get to. History of the Cold War. So out of the ashes, the United States is the most powerful country in the world. Russia, 30 years later, still clearly trying to get back on its feet in one way, shape, or form. This is how you get the modern state of Ukraine, which explains the dynamic between Russia and Ukraine now with their war and everything else going on. So yes, and there have only been two presidents. There's been three. Yeah, there's been three presidents: Putin, Medvedev, and Yeltsin. But there's only been like three real democratic elections in Russia since then. So this is the end of the Soviet Union. This is the end of the Cold War. And I know this is a very Americanized version of the telling of the story. I've tried to be fair and objective and criticize America and point out the flaws in a lot of its approach during the war. Obviously, the United States suffers embarrassing and humiliating defeats, especially early in the space race, Vietnam, the Cuban Missile Crisis. These are American blunders. So there's a lot that's pretty crazy and out of proportion with the United States, where it doesn't do as good of a job as it seems. And the Soviet Union and the question of Eastern Europe, the vacuum that emerges because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, is still being felt. And nobody actually knows how the Eastern European system is going to work. Basically, the default is bring them into NATO and the UN and make them normalized and make them democratic. That has been a slow, painful, and not so steady process throughout the last 30 years. But basically, the way the world is now, the reason there's a war in Russia and Ukraine, the Cold War has a huge part to do with that. I think it's extremely relevant and important. I think it's a big topic that requires a lot. And I didn't even get close to talking about Ellis Island, which I will talk about next week on channel and our Sunday live stream. And I hope you will join me next Friday and Saturday evenings for live Q&A, where you can ask me anything about social studies and history. And then next Sunday, we will be bringing you some more live stream lecture, Ellis Island, and maybe a couple other topics. Maybe we'll have a few things we can discuss that will be interesting to you. But I hope you've liked and enjoyed this. If you have, consider subscribing. Really helps the channel grow. I really appreciate you being around and your support and all the fun talk in the chat. And I will see you guys later. I hope you have a great week, and check out some of the long form and short form content that we bring to you every day on this channel. Take care and have a great week, and I'll see you on Friday evening. Bye-bye now.